What's going on, U.S. History people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
And we have video number 20 for you today. This one is on a bunch of stuff. We got the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas Nebraska Act, Dred Scott, and John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry. Lots of action happening in this video. So let's start off with the Compromise of 1850. This dealt with land gained from the Mexican cessions. In the previous video, we talked about the Mexican-American War, Manifest Destiny. The Compromise of 1850 is going to settle how to incorporate that land or territory into the United States. So there are 4 parts you should be familiar with. Number 1, popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession. So if you remember, popular sovereignty means that people living in the territories will decide if it will be a free or a slave state. It's not politicians, it's the people living there. 2, we have a tough fugitive slave law. There already was a fugitive slave law on the books, but this one is a much harsher slave law that will actively require Northerners to get involved in the catching of runaway slaves. 3rd part is the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. It's not the abolishment of slavery, but the slave trade. And finally, California was admitted as a free state, which will tip the balance in the Senate in favor of free states. And that's very important for understanding this next act.
All right, so moving on, we fast forward in history 4 years to 1854 with the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Mr. Norris, do you want to take a guess on what 2 states this is going to involve?
I'm going to say Kansas and Nebraska.
Oh, nice try, but you're right. Kansas Nebraska Act is the correct answer. So let's talk about some background information for what is the Kansas Nebraska Act, what it's all about. So during this time period, we see the development of railroads. We've talked about in previous videos the importance of infrastructure and the development of it at this time period through canals, through national roads. But now as technology advances, the North specifically wants to see a transcontinental railroad to go through parts of the United States. When we say transcontinental, what are we thinking, Mr. Norris?
Across the continent.
Yeah, so we want to hook up the East Coast all the way to areas of the West Coast. So how is this going to happen? And as this discussion starts to come about within the United States, there's also talk about bringing 2 new states into the Union, both Kansas and Nebraska, but they were above the 3630 line within the Louisiana Territory. And we know above the 3630 line is
free.
Below it is
slave.
So this is going to be a problem specifically for the South because they're going to see an imbalance in Congress if these 2 states were to come into the Union as free. So this becomes a problem.
So Stephen Douglas, a popular politician during the 1850s and 1860s, proposed the Kansas Nebraska Act. And what this called for was popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, allowing the people to vote on whether these territories should be free or slave states. All right, so the expectation was that Kansas would be slave and Nebraska would be free. So you have that balance of free and slave states admitting into the country. And this would overturn the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So we'll see if it actually played out that way.
All right, so continuing with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this is going to lead to what was known as Bleeding Kansas. So underline, circle, star this phrase, Bleeding Kansas, and what this was fighting in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. So you had abolitionists, and then you also had supporters of slavery moving into Kansas in order to try to impact the outcome of what the state was going to be. This leads to a guy by the name of John Brown and his followers moving to this area. So during this time period, John Brown and some of his followers move into Kansas, ultimately killing 5 pro-slave individuals at
Pottawatomie Creek.
Nice pronunciation.
Thank you.
Fighting continued in the state on and off really until the actual outbreak of the Civil War. So Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 kind of leads to us to Bleeding Kansas, which is kind of the prelude, unfortunately, to the actual all-out Civil War between the North and the South.
All right, let's jump over to 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. Some background info. Dred Scott, pictured here, was a slave. He traveled to free territories with his slave owner. When his slave owner dies, he is going to sue for his freedom. So if you look here at Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice, you might think he looks a lot like a wet golden retriever, and you would be correct. Now, he is going to rule. He's going to be one of the key players to rule on the Dred Scott decision. And the Supreme Court will say that African Americans, both free and slave, were not citizens and could not sue in court. This will be a huge setback for African Americans. He also stated that slaves were considered property and could not be taken away without due process. That was found in your 5th Amendment. And finally, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and Congress could not regulate slavery in the territory. So this was a huge victory for Southern slave holders.
All right, so moving on to the impact of the Dred Scott case of 1857, we see continued tensions between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. Some sought to not enforce the Supreme Court decision and just wanted to ignore it. Others felt that obviously it needed to be supported because it was a constitutional decision from the perspective of the Supreme Court. So ultimately, this did split the Democratic Party along sectional lines. So you had Democrats in the North and Democrats in the South. African Americans will not be granted full citizenship until the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, following the end of the Civil War.
So we'll finish up with Harpers Ferry, and this is John Brown again, the guy from Kansas. He wanted to start a massive slave rebellion, and he's pictured here at 59 years of age, just on the eve of him starting this rebellion. So he and several followers, they took over the arsenal, and an arsenal is a place that stores weapons. There were 100,000 guns, rifles, stored at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, in this small little town about 60 miles away from Washington, D.C. The rebellion failed. It was a huge failure on his part, but it increased tensions between the North and the South. Many Southerners will fear that there are more John Brown-like attacks coming from the North. So this instills a lot of fear in the South, a lot of distrust, and it's right on the eve of the Civil War, which we'll talk about in the next video.
All right, so let's recap very quickly 4 parts of the Compromise of 1850 you need to be aware of. Mr. Norris, do you remember those 4 parts?
Popular sovereignty, Fugitive Slave Act, abolition of the slave trade in D.C., and California was added as a free state.
Excellent. Kansas Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise. We had the Dred Scott decision and its impacts. All were attempts to address the issue of slavery in the territories as the United States continues to move west with that idea of manifest destiny. And finally, John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry kind of shows the use of violence by some abolitionists in order to try and attempt to end slavery. So all of these leading us down this path to eventual civil war between the North and the South.
All right, guys, thanks for watching. Look forward to see you back here for video number 21. It will be on the Civil War. Best of luck this year, and have a good day.